The Apollo Theater in Harlem stood like a cathedral of sound on that humid summer evening in 1968. Outside, 125th Street buzzed with the energy of a neighborhood that never truly slept. Neon signs flickered against the darkening sky, casting colorful shadows on the sidewalks where people gathered in small groups, discussing everything from politics to sports to the latest music releases. The air carried the scent of fried chicken from nearby restaurants, mixed with the earthy smell of rain that threatened to fall, but never quite did. Street vendors called out to passers-by, selling everything from roasted peanuts to bootleg records, their voices adding to the symphony of urban life that made Harlem feel like the center of the world. Inside the legendary venue, nearly 2,000 people packed every seat, their anticipation building like pressure in a steam engine about to blow. The Apollo had witnessed countless performances over the decades, but tonight felt different in a way that even the veterans in the crowd could sense. Tonight, the godfather of soul himself was scheduled to perform, and the community had turned out in full force, dressed in their absolute finest. Young couples who had saved for weeks to afford tickets sat beside elderly folks who remembered when the theater first opened its doors back in 1934. Children squeezed into the balcony seats, their eyes wide with excitement, their parents having brought them to witness history in the making. The theater itself seemed to pulse with life, its Art Deco architecture and plush red seats creating an atmosphere that felt both elegant and alive with raw energy. The crowd represented every slice of Harlem life. There were factory workers who had rushed home to shower and change after their shifts, still smelling faintly of machine oil and honest labor. There were school teachers in their Sunday best, having marked this date on their calendars months in advance. Local business owners sat in the better seats, their success evident in their tailored suits and polished shoes, while struggling artists filled the cheaper sections, clutching programs they hoped to get signed after the show. The atmosphere crackled with conversation, laughter, and the kind of communal joy that only happened when people came together for something truly special. Friends called out to each other across the aisles, waving and promising to catch up during intermission. The smell of perfume and cologne mixed with the theater's own unique scent of old wood, velvet, and decades of performances that had seeped into the very walls. Ushers in crisp uniforms guided latecomers to their seats, their faces showing the professional patience of people who had worked hundreds of shows but still found magic in each one. In the lobby, framed photographs of legends who had graced this stage lined the walls like a hall of fame, silent witnesses to the continuing tradition of excellence that the Apollo represented. James Brown stood backstage in his dressing room, a small but functional space that had hosted countless performers over the years. His purple suit was immaculate, custom-tailored to fit his frame perfectly, with sharp lines that caught the light when he moved. Every detail mattered to James, from the shine on his patent leather shoes to the precise part in his processed hair. At 35 years old, he had already become a living legend, but the weight of that title never made him complacent or lazy. If anything, it drove him harder, pushed him to give more, to be better, to prove that he deserved every bit of praise that came his way. He stretched his legs methodically, rolled his shoulders to loosen the muscles, and practiced a few quick dance steps on the worn wooden floor, checking his balance and making sure his body was ready for the physical demands he was about to place on it. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror surrounded by bright bulbs, and he saw not just a performer, but a man carrying the hopes and dreams of everyone who would watch him tonight. He adjusted his collar, checked his cufflinks, and took several deep breaths to center himself in that space between nervousness and confidence that every great performer knows intimately. His band members, some of whom had been with him for years through thick and thin, tuned their instruments in the adjacent room, the sound of a saxophone running through scales, mixed with the deep thump of a bass guitar being tested, creating a warm-up symphony that was music in itself. The drummer tapped out complex rhythms on his practice pad, his hands moving so fast they became a blur. The guitar player checked his amplifier settings one more time, making tiny adjustments that only a true professional would notice or care about. These men were more than employees to James. They were his brothers in art, the engine that powered his vision and made his performances possible. They had traveled together on buses that broke down in the middle of nowhere, played shows in towns where they weren't always welcome, and celebrated triumphs that felt like miracles. Now they prepared for another night of giving everything they had, to an audience that deserved nothing less than perfection. James could hear the crowd beyond the curtain, their voices creating a low rumble of expectation that made his heart beat faster and his palms sweat just slightly. He had performed hundreds of shows, maybe thousands if he really sat down and counted them all, but each one still gave him that electric feeling in his chest, that beautiful anxiety that reminded him he was alive and doing what he was born to do. His manager, Charles, a thin man with sharp eyes and a mind for business that had served James well over the years, knocked on the door and stuck his head in. Without saying a word, he gave James a nod that meant it was almost time, that the crowd was ready, that the moment had arrived. James nodded back, understanding passing between them in that silent language that comes from years of working together. He stood up, adjusted his suit one final time, ran his hands through his hair to make sure every strand was in place, and walked toward the stage entrance with the confident stride of a man who owned every room he entered. The familiar smell of old wood, dust, and decades of excitement filled his nostrils as he prepared to give these people everything he had, to leave nothing in reserve, to make this night one they would talk about for years to come. The narrow hallway leading to the stage felt both endless and too short, time doing that strange thing it does before important moments. He could hear his band taking their positions on stage, the rustle of music stands being adjusted, instruments being picked up, final preparations being made. Then came the moment he lived for, the moment that made all the hard work and sacrifice worthwhile. The house lights dimmed slowly, deliberately, and the crowd erupted into cheers that shook the ornate walls of the Apollo Theatre. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that hit you in the chest and reminded you why live performance would never be replaced by any recording. James emerged from the wings with his characteristic energy, his feet already moving to a rhythm only he could hear, a rhythm that came from somewhere deep inside him. The spotlight found him immediately, and he seemed to glow in its beam, transformed from man to legend in an instant. The band launched into the opening number without missing a beat, a funky groove that got people out of their seats immediately, hands clapping, bodies swaying. The horn section blasted notes that seemed to bounce off every surface, the sound so big and bold it felt like it could knock down walls. The drummer laid down a beat so tight and precise it felt like a heartbeat, steady and strong and absolutely unshakable. James grabbed the microphone with both hands, his trademark move, and his voice cut through the music like a hot knife through butter, clear and powerful and full of emotion that couldn't be faked or manufactured. He sang about love, about struggle, about the feeling of being alive in a world that tried to keep you down but couldn't break your spirit if you refused to let it. Every word came from somewhere real, somewhere deep, and the audience could feel that authenticity in their bones. James moved across the stage with a dancer's grace and an athlete's power, spinning, sliding, dropping to his knees, and popping back up in moves that seemed to defy physics and common sense. The audience responded to every word, every gesture, every spin and slide he executed, with the precision of someone who had practiced these movements 10,000 times until they became second nature. Women in the front rows waved handkerchiefs, some with tears streaming down their faces, moved by the sheer emotional power of what they were witnessing. Men nodded their heads in approval, recognizing excellence when they saw it, respecting the craft and dedication on display. The entire theater became a single organism moving to the same pulse, breathing together, feeling together, experiencing something that transcended mere entertainment and became something close to spiritual. 20 minutes into the set, James was drenched in sweat that ran down his face and soaked through his purple suit, but his energy never flagged for even a second. If anything, he seemed to be gaining momentum, feeding off the crowd's energy and giving it back to them multiplied. He pointed to the band, a quick gesture that they understood immediately from years of performing together, and they shifted into another gear, the tempo increasing as he prepared to launch into one of his signature songs, the one everyone had been waiting for. The anticipation in the room became almost unbearable, people leaning forward in their seats, hands ready to clap, voices ready to sing along. The first notes rang out, clear and unmistakable, and the crowd roared its approval. Then, without any warning whatsoever, everything went dark. The music stopped abruptly, cut off mid-note, as if someone had sliced through it with a sword. The lights died completely, plunging the Apollo Theatre into a darkness so total and unexpected that it took everyone a moment to understand what had happened. For several long seconds, there was only silence and confusion, the sudden absence of sound almost louder than the music had been. The darkness that swallowed the Apollo Theatre was absolute and disorienting. In an instant, 2,000 people went from experiencing the thrill of their lives to sitting in confusion, unable to see even the person next to them. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity, a suspended moment where nobody quite knew what to do or how to react. Then came the murmurs, the nervous laughter, the shuffling of feet and rustling of programs as people tried to make sense of what had just happened. Someone in the balcony called out, asking if everyone was okay, their voice echoing strangely in the darkness. A few people pulled out cigarette lighters, creating tiny islands of flickering light that did little to illuminate the vast space, but somehow made people feel slightly less lost. The ushers fumbled for their flashlights, their training kicking in as they tried to maintain calm and prevent panic. Children clutched their parents' hands tighter, some whimpering softly, while the adults whispered reassurances they weren't entirely sure they believed themselves. The Apollo had experienced technical difficulties before, but never quite like this, never at such a crucial moment in a performance that had been building to something truly spectacular. Backstage, the situation was equally chaotic. Charles rushed through the darkness toward the electrical panel, his hands extended in front of him to avoid running into equipment or walls. His mind raced through possibilities and solutions, wondering if this was a blown fuse, a circuit breaker issue, or something more serious that would require calling in professional help. The band members stood frozen on stage, their instruments silent in their hands, looking toward where they knew James had been standing moments before, but unable to see him in the total darkness. Some of them called out his name, asking if he was all right, their voices tinged with concern and frustration. The bass player carefully set down his instrument, afraid of tripping over cables in the dark. The drummer sat still on his stool, not wanting to knock over his carefully arranged kit. Meanwhile, theater staff hurried through the backstage areas with whatever light sources they could find, checking on the power situation and trying to determine how long it would take to restore electricity. The stage manager, a woman named Dorothy who had worked at the Apollo for 15 years and thought she had seen everything, grabbed her emergency lantern and headed toward the main stage, her priority being to check on James and the band and to communicate anything to the increasingly restless audience. But James Brown was not the kind of man who waited for problems to solve themselves. Standing alone in the darkness on that stage, he felt something shift inside him, a realization that this moment could either become a disaster that people remembered for all the wrong reasons, or it could become something else entirely, something magical that would be talked about for generations. His mind worked quickly, cycling through options and possibilities with the speed of someone who had spent his entire life thinking on his feet and adapting to circumstances beyond his control. He had grown up with nothing, had clawed his way to success through sheer determination and talent, had overcome obstacles that would have broken lesser people. A power outage, he decided in that instant, was not going to stop him from giving these people the show they had paid to see and deserved to experience. He thought about the crowd sitting in darkness, their disappointment palpable, even though he couldn't see their faces. He thought about the children who had come to see him perform, who might never get another chance like this. He thought about his responsibility as an entertainer, as someone who had been given a gift and a platform to deliver something meaningful no matter what challenges arose. James took a deep breath and made his decision. Without conferring with his band, without waiting for the power to come back on, without knowing if his plan would work or if people would think he had lost his mind, he began to sing. His voice rose up from the darkness, unaccompanied by any instruments, just the raw power of his vocal cords and the emotion he poured into every note. He sang the song he had been about to perform when the lights went out, but now it sounded completely different, stripped down to its essential elements, vulnerable and honest in a way that even his most passionate performances rarely achieved. The first few notes seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment James worried that this had been a terrible mistake, that people would be confused or disappointed by this acoustic version of what was supposed to be a high-energy funk number. But then something remarkable happened. The crowd, which had been murmuring in confusion and disappointment, fell completely silent. Every person in that theater stopped talking, stopped moving, stopped doing anything except listening to the voice coming from the darkness of the stage. The sound was haunting and beautiful, echoing through the Apollo in a way that amplified its emotional impact. Without the distraction of lights, elaborate dance moves, or even instrumental accompaniment, James's voice became the only thing that mattered, the only thing that existed in that moment. People found themselves leaning forward in their seats, straining to catch every word, every nuance, every bit of feeling that he packed into each phrase. The song took on new meaning in the darkness, its lyrics about perseverance and hope resonating in a way they never had before. James moved carefully across the stage as he sang, his hands extended slightly to avoid obstacles, his voice never wavering despite the unusual circumstances. He could feel the audience's attention locked on him, could sense their breath held in anticipation of each new line. This was not what anyone had expected, not what they had come to see, but somehow it was exactly what they needed. A reminder that real talent didn't need elaborate production or expensive equipment, that true artistry could shine through even when everything else failed. As James continued to sing, something magical began to happen throughout the theater. At first it was just one or two voices joining in on the chorus, people who knew the song well enough to sing along even in complete darkness. Then more voices joined in, and more until it seemed like everyone in the Apollo was singing together, creating a choir of 2,000 people united by music and the shared experience of this unexpected moment. The sound was overwhelming, moving in ways that a regular performance could never quite achieve. Strangers harmonized with each other, their voices blending in the darkness into something greater than the sum of its parts. James felt tears prick at his eyes as he heard the crowd singing with him, supporting him, proving that music was more powerful than any technical difficulty or temporary setback. He improvised new lyrics, responding to the energy in the room, and the crowd followed his lead, adapting and flowing with him. The band members, still standing in darkness on the stage, began to clap rhythmically, providing a simple but effective percussion that gave structure to the communal singing. Minutes passed, though nobody could say exactly how many, time becoming irrelevant when measured against the emotional intensity of what was happening. James led the crowd through 3 different songs, each one building on the energy of the previous one, each one bringing people closer together in ways that a normal concert never quite managed. He encouraged people to clap along, to stomp their feet, to make their own music in whatever way felt right to them. The Apollo Theatre transformed from a venue experiencing a technical problem into something resembling a revival meeting, a block party, a family gathering where everyone belonged and everyone contributed. People who had come as strangers found themselves holding hands with the people next to them, swaying together in the darkness. The social barriers that normally existed in public spaces melted away, replaced by a sense of community and shared humanity that felt rare and precious. Charles, who had been frantically working on the electrical problem, stopped for a moment to listen, realizing that James had turned a potential catastrophe into something extraordinary, something that people would remember for the rest of their lives. Finally, after what might have been 15 minutes or might have been an hour, the lights flickered back to life. The sudden brightness was almost shocking after the extended darkness, causing people to blink and shield their eyes for a moment. But as their vision adjusted, what they saw was remarkable. James stood center stage, his purple suit wrinkled and soaked with sweat, his processed hair no longer perfect, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had just poured his entire soul into a performance. But he was smiling the biggest, most genuine smile anyone had ever seen on his face, and when he looked out at the crowd, he saw 2,000 people on their feet, not just sitting politely, but standing and cheering with an intensity that shook the building to its foundations. The applause was deafening, a roar of approval and gratitude that seemed to go on forever. People were crying openly, overcome with emotion at what they had just experienced. The band members behind James looked stunned, moved beyond words by what had just happened. James raised his hands, trying to quiet the crowd so he could speak, but the applause continued for several more minutes. When it finally died down enough for him to be heard, he stepped up to the microphone, which was now working again, and spoke from the heart in a way he rarely allowed himself to do in public. He thanked the audience for their patience, for their willingness to embrace the unexpected, for proving that music was about connection rather than production values or perfect conditions. He told them they had just shown him something important about the power of community and the resilience of the human spirit. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, and nobody in that theater doubted the sincerity of every word. Then, with the lights fully restored and the power stable once again, James signaled to his band, and they launched into the most energetic, joyful performance of their careers. The show that followed the power outage was extraordinary, with James dancing and singing with renewed vigor, the crowd responding with enthusiasm that never wavered. But everyone there knew that the real magic had happened in the darkness, in those precious minutes when nothing existed except voices raised together in song, proving that the best performances sometimes happen when everything goes wrong and artists rise to meet the moment with courage, creativity, and heart.